There is a boy, somewhere in the suburban sprawl, just outside of Tokyo, crouched at the edge of a pond. It is the late 1960s. He has a jar in his hand. His knees are muddy. Around him, the world hums with the soft percussion of insects, the rustle of reeds, the distant sound of a city that has not yet swallowed this little patch of wilderness. He is catching bugs. He does not know it yet, but he is also catching something else entirely. He is catching the seed of the most successful media franchise the world has ever seen. That boy was Satoshi Tajiri. And everything you have ever loved about Pokémon, every city, every battle, every late night spent grinding levels before a gym fight, traces back to that muddy boy at the edge of that Japanese pond. So tonight, we are going slow. We are going deep. This is not a countdown. This is a journey through 150 of the most obscure, startling, and genuinely fascinating facts about the Pokémon franchise that most people will never discover on their own. We are going through the games, the anime, the trading cards, the mythology, the glitches, the banned episodes, the scrap designs, and the hidden mechanics that reward the most patient and curious players. And we are doing it the way these things deserve to be explored, unhurried, thorough, like turning over a stone and being genuinely amazed at what lives underneath. Pour something warm. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Part 1. The boy who dreamed in Bug's origins of the world's biggest franchise. To understand Pokémon, you have to understand what the world looked like before it existed. And to do that, you have to understand Satoshi Tajiri. Fact 1. Satoshi Tajiri was not born a game designer. He was born, in 1965, in the Setagaya ward of Tokyo, a bug collector. His neighborhood in Machida was still semi-rural in those years, laced with the kind of ponds and tall grass that only exist at the margin between city and countryside. He spent his childhood on his hands and knees in those margins, hunting beetles and dragonflies and water striders with such single-minded obsession that his classmates gave him the nickname Dr. Bug. He genuinely wanted to grow up to be an entomologist. He wanted to study insects for a living, and in a strange way, that is exactly what he ended up doing. The reason this matters is not just biographical flavor. The entire architecture of Pokémon, the collecting, the trading, the thrill of stumbling upon something rare in tall grass is a direct, almost one-to-one translation of Tajiri's childhood experience onto a Game Boy cartridge. When you feel the rush of a shiny appearing after hours of searching, you are feeling an emotion that Tajiri first felt as a kid reaching into a stream with both hands. That is not metaphor, that is engineering. Fact 2. As Machida urbanized through the 1970s, the ponds were drained, the tall grass was paved over, the places where Tajiri used to lose whole afternoons simply ceased to exist. He later described this loss as one of the formative experiences of his creative life. He wanted to give children of the future something that he had lost a way to experience the thrill and intimacy of searching for small living things in a world that was rapidly running out of room for them. Pokémon is, at its philosophical core, an act of preservation. It is a nature preserve made of pixels. Fact 3. When Tajiri was a teenager, his second obsession overtook his first. Arcade games consumed him the way bugs once had. He was skipping school to play at the local arcade, which horrified his parents, but he was not just playing, he was studying. He was reading the machines, absorbing the way they worked, the way they rewarded and punished players, the way they manufactured desire. At 17 years old, he began publishing a small handwritten fanzine about video games that he called Game Freak. The first issue was a few pages of paper, stapled together, covered in his own pixel art drawings. One of those early covers featured Dig Dug. Fact 4. The artist who would illustrate Game Freak, the fanzine, was a young man named Ken Sugimori. Sugimori and Tajiri became creative partners, and when the magazine grew into something with over 10,000 readers, they decided they were wasting their energy writing about other people's games. In 1989, they formally converted Game Freak from a magazine into a video game development studio. The transition was not smooth. For several years, they made very little money and worked in genuinely harsh conditions. But Tajiri had an idea he could not let go of. Fact 5. The exact moment of the Pokémon concept's origin has become something close to mythology within gaming culture. Tajiri saw two people playing Game Boys, linked together by the small cable Nintendo had designed to allow games to communicate. He saw that cable and had what he later described as a vision of a small creature crawling from one machine to the other along the wire. In one instant, his childhood love of bug collecting and his adult obsession with video games collapsed into a single idea. A game where you caught creatures, raised them, and sent them to a friend. A digital ecosystem built along a wire. He called the initial concept Capsule Monsters. Later, it became Pocket Monsters, and then, after trademark issues in the United States, the word we all know, Pokémon. Fact 6. The development of Pokémon Red and Green took 6 years. 6 years. This was not because the team was slow. It was because the project was almost killed multiple times. Nintendo was skeptical. The Game Boy was aging hardware by the time the game was ready, and multiple executives questioned whether a role-playing game built around collectible creatures had any future. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and Zelda, stepped in as a mentor, and his belief in the project helped keep it alive. Miyamoto's faith in Tajiri is one of the hidden pillars of the franchise's existence. Fact 7. The original Pokémon concept was originally called Capsule Monsters, and the pitch document Tajiri submitted to Nintendo in the early 1990s almost reads like a short story. He described a world where humans and creatures coexisted, where the joy was not in defeating monsters, but in discovering, collecting, and forming bonds with them. He explicitly drew a line from bug collecting to the game's core mechanics. The document was reportedly confusing to Nintendo executives who had never seen anything quite like it, but the sincerity and clarity of the vision and Miyamoto's endorsement pushed it through. Fact 8. The name of the protagonist in the original Japanese games is Satoshi. The rival is named Shigeru, after Shigeru Miyamoto. This is not a coincidence. Tajiri embedded the creative relationship that built the franchise directly into the games themselves. When Ash Ketchum and Gary Oak face off in the anime, they are, in a quiet and beautiful way, a reflection of the real-world collaboration between the bug-obsessed game designer and the legendary game creator who believed in him. Fact 9. Ken Sugimori, the artist who designed the original 151 Pokémon, worked from an almost unimaginably small brief. There were no reference sheets, no strict guidelines for what a Pokémon could or could not look like. Tajiri simply wanted creatures that felt alive, that felt like they belonged to a shared world with consistent internal logic, and that covered a broad emotional range from frightening to adorable. Sugimori drew all 151 original designs with ink and paper, working through concepts with the discipline of an illustrator and the imagination of someone who had never been told what was impossible. Fact 10. The very first Pokémon sketch Ken Sugimori drew for what would become the series was not Pikachu. It was not Bulbasaur. It was, according to historical records and Sugimori's own accounts, Clefairy. The round, pink, big-eyed fairy Pokémon that most Western players associate with the early anime was, in fact, the creature that started everything. Clefairy was the original candidate for franchise mascot. The reasons it lost that role to Pikachu are both interesting and important, and we will get to them later, but know, as you hold any Pikachu merchandise in your mind right now, that the world came very close to looking very different. Fact 11. When the games were finally released in Japan in February 1996 as Pocket Monsters Red and Green, they were released into a market that had largely moved on from the Game Boy. The console was outdated, sales started slowly. But among younger Japanese children who could not afford the flashier console hardware, the game spread from hand to hand like a slow fire. The link cable mechanic, which required players to physically connect their Game Boys to trade and battle, created a social ecosystem around the cartridges that no other game had achieved. Pokémon spread not because of advertising, but because of human connection. Kids had to have it because their friends had it. The link cable was the first social network. Fact 12. Pokémon Blue, the third version of the first games, was originally created as a mail-order exclusive in Japan, a special version available only to subscribers of CoroCoro Comic Magazine. It was not a retail product. The Western localization team collapsed Red, Green, and Blue into what became the international release of Red and Blue, swapping in Blue's higher quality sprites for the older red and green artwork. This means that the Pokémon Red and Blue that Western players experienced in 1998 was a hybrid product that never existed in exactly that form in Japan. The games we grew up with are, in a technical sense, their own unique artifact. If you have made it this far, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me two things. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in Tokyo is settling in for the night with this, while someone in Toronto is waking up with their morning coffee. Drop your location and your time below. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. We have a long way to go tonight. Part 2. Generation 1's Hidden Architecture. Glitches, secrets, and the mechanics no one told you about. The original Pokémon games are deceptively simple objects. 2 small cartridges, a modest color palette, creatures made of dozens of pixels moving on a postage stamp screen. But underneath that surface, simplicity is a layer of code, so dense, so strange, and so full of accidental miracles that researchers and data miners are still pulling new discoveries out of it 30 years later. These are not just glitches. They are windows into the way the games were made, and into the strange beauty that happens when human creativity collides with the hard limits of aging hardware. Fact 13. Missing No is the most famous glitch in gaming history, but almost everything most people believe about it is wrong. Missing No was not an accident. It was, in a real sense, intentional, or at least intentionally preserved. When Game Freak wrote the code for the Pokédex, they needed placeholder data to fill entries that did not yet have a Pokémon assigned to them. Rather than leave empty slots that might cause the game to crash, they created placeholder data structures to hold the space. Missing No is what happens when the game tries to render one of those placeholder entries as if it were a real Pokémon. It has a sprite. It has a cry. It has stat data. It is not nothing. It is the ghost of the game's own construction process, briefly made visible. Fact 14. When you encounter Missing No along the coastal water route near Cinnabar Island, the most famous side effect is item duplication. The 6th item in your bag gets multiplied sometimes to more than 100 copies. This happens because of the way the game stores data in memory. The routine that triggers the old man's name entry tutorial in Viridian City writes your trainer's name into a specific block of memory. And that same memory block is later read to determine what kind of wild Pokémon appear on the coastal route. Missing No is the code equivalent of a sentence that doesn't make grammatical sense. The game tries to interpret your trainer's name as a Pokémon species, and the result is one of gaming's most enduring anomalies. Fact 15. There is a whole universe of glitch Pokémon in Red and Blue beyond Missing No. One of the most notable is a glitch entity referred to by fans as M or M Block, which resembles Missing No but has different properties. Encountering M can corrupt your Hall of Fame data, cause graphical anomalies throughout the game, and in some circumstances produce entirely unexpected behaviors that seem to suggest the game is trying to do something coherent and simply failing. Some of these glitch entities have unique cries, unique move pools, and unique behaviors in battle. They are not junk, they are artifacts, each one a tiny archaeological dig into what the game was at different stages of its own becoming. Fact 16. The Mew glitch is one of the most elegant accidental discoveries in gaming history. To encounter a wild Mew at level 7 in the original games, you need to perform a precise sequence involving a trainer on Route 8 and another on Route 25, manipulating the game's memory in just the right way. What makes this remarkable is that it is not random. It is reproducible, and it works because of the specific way the game handles encounter data when you fly away from an active trainer trigger. The glitch exploits a real mechanical vulnerability in the code. Mew is there. It was always there. And the game's own architecture creates a legitimate, repeatable path to reach it, just not one that was ever intended. Fact 17. The playground myth that Mew was hidden under the truck near the SS Anne in Vermilion City is, in a strict sense, false, but it is one of the most culturally significant falsehoods in gaming history. The truck exists. You can reach it. You can interact with it. But there is no Mew underneath it, and no mechanism to reveal one. What makes the myth fascinating is that it persisted for years because it was plausible. The truck seemed like it was hiding something. Its placement felt deliberate. It was the kind of detail that invited speculation in exactly the way that Tajiri intended. He wanted his game to feel like a world with more in it than you could ever fully discover. Fact 18. The move Focus Energy in the original Red and Blue games is famously broken in the worst possible way. Its Pokédex description says it raises the critical hit ratio. Its actual in-game effect is the opposite. It lowers the critical hit chance significantly. This is a coding error, a simple bit-level mistake where a flag was set the wrong way during the calculation. Players who used Focus Energy were, for years, actively making themselves worse at the game, while believing they were preparing for a devastating streak. The move was not corrected until later generations, making it one of the longest-running uncorrected mechanical errors in the series. Fact 19. The rare candy item, which instantly levels a Pokémon up by 1, has a hidden and somewhat counterintuitive effect on competitive Pokémon. Because of how effort values work in the original games, a Pokémon that reaches its final level through rare candies, rather than actual battle experience, will have lower stats than one that fought its way to that level. This is because battle experience generates EVs, the hidden training points that boost individual stats, while rare candies give none. A trainer who fed their Pokémon a sack of rare candies and then took it to the Elite Four was, mechanically, fighting at a handicap they were completely unaware of. Fact 20. The Safari Zone in Kanto was originally going to have a time-based mechanic rather than the step-counting system that made it into the final game. Internal development documents suggest that early designs gave players a countdown clock, a fixed amount of real time to catch as many rare Pokémon as possible before being escorted out. This was changed to the step system because it was easier to program on the Game Boy's limited hardware. But consider how different the Safari Zone experience would have been with a real-time countdown. The frantic energy of a ticking clock would have fundamentally altered the rhythm of one of the game's most beloved areas. Fact 21. The old man in Viridian City who blocks the road north until he has had his morning coffee is not just a narrative device. His existence serves a mechanical purpose in the game's memory management. The sequence where he teaches you to catch a Weedle uses a specific slot of the Game Boy's RAM to store tutorial data, and that same RAM slot is later used to store wild encounter tables for specific areas. This is why the Mew glitch works. The old man's tutorial writes data into memory in a way that can be manipulated. He is not just a gatekeeper, he is a load-bearing element of the game's underlying architecture. Fact 22. In the original Red and Blue, Professor Oak's lab contains a computer that the player never uses. But if you were to hack the game and access its contents, you would find a small piece of text suggesting that it was intended to allow players to access some kind of early storage system for Pokémon. This feature was ultimately given to the Pokémon Centers and their PC systems, but the presence of Oak's unused terminal suggests the design of the storage feature went through multiple iterations before landing on the version players ended up with. Fact 23. The rooftop vending machines in the Celadon department store contain a tiny piece of text that players rarely notice a suggestion that empty bottles could be returned. This has led researchers to believe that Game Freak originally designed a recycling mechanic of some kind, where returning bottles would reward the player with items or currency. The mechanic was cut, but the text remained. It is one of dozens of tiny textual fossils embedded in the original games that hint at features that existed in some form during development but never made it to the cartridge. Fact 24. The Glitch City exploit, where saving and resetting during a Safari Zone game at exactly the right moment causes the player to warp into a corrupted, surreal version of Fuchsia City, is one of the strangest artifacts in early gaming. The corrupted map creates landscapes that should be impossible, with tiles scrambled in ways that produce visual experiences unlike anything intentionally designed. Players who stumbled into Glitch City describe the feeling as entering a dreamlike, alien version of a place they thought they knew. It is entirely accidental, born from the game's attempt to load map data that is not properly initialized, and it created one of gaming's earliest, genuinely surreal exploration experiences. Fact 25. Lavender Town, the small, fog-haunted village in Pokémon Red and Blue, where Pokémon go to die and trainers go to pay their respects, has been the center of one of the most persistent urban legends in gaming history, the so-called Lavender Town Syndrome, a claim that the original Japanese version's music caused headaches, behavioral changes, and in some accounts, worse, among young players. Let's be clear, the Lavender Town Syndrome story, in its most extreme forms, is an internet-era creepypasta. It is not a documented public health event, but there is a real kernel of truth in it. The original Japanese Lavender Town music was genuinely different from the international version harsher, with more dissonant tones that were softened before the Western release. Game Freak was concerned about the sound coming through the Game Boy's small speaker in ways that might be unpleasant. The game's music was adjusted for localization. The creepypasta is fiction, but the dissonance that inspired it was real. Fact 26. There is an invisible PC in a house in Celadon City. If you press the A button on a specific tile, the game responds as if you are interacting with a computer, even though no computer is visible in the room. This happened because the Game Freak developers copied the map data from another house that did contain a PC and forgot to remove the interaction script from the new map. It is completely harmless, but players who discovered it in the late 1990s immediately began constructing theories around it. Hidden storage, secret items, a backdoor to a mystery. The truth is more mundane, but somehow more charming. A developer was tired, copy-pasted a bit of code, and accidentally created one of Kanto's enduring mysteries. Fact 27. The bicycle is one of the most coveted items in the original games, famously requiring a bike voucher from a specific NPC because it is too expensive to simply purchase. What is less known is that the bicycle's behavior in the original code is essentially identical to the running shoes from later games. The speed increase it provides is calculated the same way. This means the entire elaborate quest to obtain the bicycle was built around a mechanic that could have been implemented much more simply. Game Freak chose complexity because the bicycle itself felt meaningful as an object, a piece of transportation with weight and identity that running shoes could not provide. Fact 28. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town is the only location in the game where the player can encounter wild Pokemon without walking through tall grass. This was entirely intentional. The ghost-type encounters in the tower were designed to feel different, more oppressive, as if the game's normal rules did not apply in a place where the boundary between life and death was already blurred. You could not see the Pokemon coming. They simply appeared, like the ghosts they were. Part 3. What the Pokédex is actually telling you the dark lore. Here is something that took years for the mainstream Pokemon audience to fully reckon with. The Pokédex, that cheerful, encyclopedic device that your character carries around like a high-tech notebook, is actually one of the darkest documents in fiction. Not because of any one entry, but because of the accumulation of them, entry after entry, quietly describing a world where creatures routinely abduct children, feed on human life force, possess the bodies of the dead, and exist in states of suffering so profound that reading them closely feels like stumbling into a horror anthology disguised as a children's game. Let's go through some of the most remarkable ones. Fact 29. Yamask was introduced in Pokemon Black and White, and its Pokédex entry from Pokemon Black remains one of the most disturbing pieces of lore the franchise has ever committed to print. It reads, in the official English localization, each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. Read that again slowly. Yamask was a human being. The mask it carries is its own face. Its own human face, preserved after death, worn like a memento mori, and it cries when it looks at it. This is not the bittersweet melancholy that the franchise occasionally dips into. This is existential grief, rendered in the gentlest possible visual language, a floating ghost, a gold mask, and it is extraordinary that it exists in a game rated E for everyone. What makes the Yamask lore even more harrowing is its evolutionary endpoint. When Yamask evolves into Cofagrigus, the mask disappears. It is consumed by the evolution, which means that when a Yamask becomes Cofagrigus, it loses the last physical connection to its human identity. It becomes something entirely other. The mourning ends not with healing, but with erasure. Fact 30. Drifloon is a ghost and flying type that looks like a purple balloon with a tuft of clouds on its head. It is one of the most apparently cheerful designs in the franchise. Its Pokédex entry from Pokemon Sun reads, stories go that it grabs the hands of small children and drags them away to the afterlife. It dislikes heavy children. There is so much to unpack in that final sentence that it almost circles back around to comedy. Drifloon, the child-abducting balloon, has a preference for smaller, lighter children because it lacks the lift to carry heavier ones. The implication, the thing the entry is absolutely not saying explicitly but absolutely means, is that Drifloon exists at playgrounds and parks, drifting among children who mistake it for a toy, waiting for one to grab its string. It is, in design and lore, the Pokémon equivalent of a predator that uses cute aesthetics as a lure. Fact 31. Gengar's lore has been building quietly across 30 years of Pokédex entries into something that approaches genuine horror. Various entries across different games establish that Gengar was once human, that humans who die in specific circumstances become Gengar rather than passing on. One entry states that Gengar slips into the shadow of its victim to steal warmth and life. Another describes it as hiding in shadow so perfectly that it can pass as your own shadow on the street. A third states that on the night of a full moon, if you see shadows moving and laughing on their own, it is Gengar at play. And the sword entry for Gengar's Gigantamax form, one of the most recent versions of this lore, describes the massive form, opening its enormous mouth to swallow prey, using the voices of loved ones to lure victims close enough to consume. Fact 32. Kadabra's Pokédex entry across multiple games establishes that it was once a human child with psychic powers who transformed into a Pokémon one day while helping with ESP research. No explanation is given. No mechanism is described. A boy sat down in a science experiment and woke up as a Kadabra. The entry simply states this as fact, as if it is not the premise of a science fiction horror story, as if a child becoming a spoon-bending alien creature without any apparent transition or consent is just one of those things that happens. Fact 33. Cubone's lore is famous enough that it has become something of a franchise standard-bearer for Pokémon Sadness, a small creature wearing its dead mother's skull as a helmet, crying so frequently that the skull becomes permanently stained with tear marks. But what is less known is that the beta art for Cubone, discovered in development files for the original games, showed Cubone with multiple different skull designs, suggesting different mother species for different individual Cubones. The lore could have been even more specific, more brutal, each Cubone a unique tragedy, each skull a different story. The design was simplified for the final game, but those early sketches suggest the developers were, at one point, committed to making the creature's grief as individualized as possible. Fact 34. Parasect is perhaps the most genuinely biological horror in the franchise. The creature is a bug covered in a massive mushroom that has grown to subsume its host almost entirely. Pokédex entries across multiple generations make progressively clearer what this means. The fungus has completely taken over. The Parasect does not have a personality. It does not have desires. Its blank, white eyes are the eyes of something that is no longer really there. The mushroom controls the movement of the creature's limbs and extracts nutrients from its body. Parasect is, in straightforward biological terms, a zombie host being piloted by a fungal parasite. The fact that this exists in a children's franchise, rendered in pixel art, is remarkable. Fact 35. Mimikyu is one of the more recent Pokémon that has earned attention for its dark lore, and the attention is warranted. Mimikyu is a ghost and fairy type that hides under a poorly drawn Pikachu disguise. The Pokédex establishes that it wears the disguise because it wants to be loved the way Pikachu is loved. It is desperately lonely and craves affection, but knows that its true form, once glimpsed, is so horrifying that the researchers who have accidentally seen it have suffered immediate breakdown. What exactly is under the disguise? No one knows. One entry states that a researcher who lifted the cloth to look underneath died of shock. Another implies that looking at the true form causes immediate, irreversible psychological trauma. Mimikyu wanders the world, wanting nothing more than friendship, carrying within it something so existentially wrong that the game refuses to show it to you. Fact 36. Frozlass, the ice and ghost type introduced in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, has an entry that reads, "The soul of a woman lost on a snowy mountain possessed an icicle, becoming this Pokémon. The food it most relishes is the souls of men." This entry is doing a remarkable amount of work in a very small space. It gives the Pokémon a specific origin story, a woman who died in the mountains. It establishes that she became a predator. And it specifies that men, specifically, are her preferred prey. Frozlass is one of very few Pokémon whose lore carries what reads like a gendered grievance built into its very nature. Fact 37. Shedinja is perhaps the strangest lore object in the franchise. When a Nincada evolves into Ninjask, a second Pokémon Shedinja appears in your party if you have an empty slot available. Shedinja is the shed husk of the Nincada, now somehow animated. It has exactly 1 HP. It cannot gain HP under any circumstances. It is immune to all damage, except moves that hit its specific type weaknesses. And its ability, Wonder Guard, makes it invincible to everything else. Shedinja's Pokédex entry states that looking into the crack in its back will steal your soul. The game's own mechanics prevent you from looking at it from behind. Shedinja is a creature that the game itself frames as too dangerous to look at directly. Fact 38. Spiritomb in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl is the only Pokémon in the franchise, outside of certain event-specific situations, that requires genuine social interaction with real human players to obtain normally. To encounter Spiritomb, you must first find the Hallowed Tower in the Underground Cavern system, then speak to 32 different players in the Underground 32 separate people, each playing their own copy of the game. For children without large social networks, this was effectively impossible without cheating. Spiritomb became, for many players, more of a legend than a real creature, something you had heard of but never seen, described in awe by the rare kid who had managed it. And the creature itself? Its Pokédex entry describes it as the bound spirit of 108 souls united into a single malevolent entity. Fact 39. Palossand is a sandcastle Pokémon introduced in Pokémon Sun and Moon that looks, charmingly, like a sandcastle with googly eyes. Its entry establishes that it created itself by possessing a sandcastle that a child built on the beach. More than that, Palossand pulls its prey down beneath the sand, extracts their life force, and deposits the dried, desiccated remains underground. The entry specifically mentions that small Pokémon who get too close are sucked beneath the surface and are never seen again. This is a children's beach toy that kills and consumes wildlife. Fact 40. The Pokédex entry for Gorbis in Ruby and Sapphire contains one of the franchise's most efficient horror moments. The entry reads, "Although Gorbis is the very picture of elegance and beauty while swimming, it is also cruel. In battle, it stabs its thin mouth into its prey and drains the prey of its body fluids from the inside. Gorbis is the anglerfish of the Pokémon world, beautiful surface, horrible interior." The franchise has a long tradition of this particular design philosophy, where the more pleasant a Pokémon looks, the worse its actual ecological behavior tends to be. Part 4. The Pokémon that almost were beta designs, scrapped creatures, and lost history. In 2018, something extraordinary happened. An anonymous person posted a download link to ROM images of an early development build of Pokémon Gold and Silver, a demo version of the games as they existed at the Nintendo Space World trade show in November 1997, more than 2 years before the finished games were released. The files were quickly distributed and analyzed, and what researchers found inside was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in gaming history. This was not a polished preview build. It was a raw development snapshot, still full of unfinished ideas, placeholder content, and designs that would never make it to retail. And what it revealed about what the second generation of Pokémon games could have looked like is astonishing. Fact 41. The Space World 1997 Gold and Silver demo contained designs for over 40 Pokémon that never appeared in the final games. Some of them are clearly early versions of Pokémon that did make it through Pichu, Entei, and Snubbull. All appear in recognizable but meaningfully different forms. But many of the cut designs are entirely unlike anything that ever reached a finished cartridge. There was a small bear cub with a sad expression that researchers believe may have been scrapped in favor of Teddiursa. There were multiple baby form pre-evolutions for Kanto Pokémon that never existed in the finished Johto games. A baby Vulpix, a baby Meowth, a baby Grimer, a baby Doduo. Fact 42. Perhaps the most talked about discovery in the Space World demo is Kotora, a small electric tiger cub. Kotora is adorable, round, and clearly designed to evoke the same emotional response as Pikachu, with which it shares its type. Its existence in the demo has fueled endless speculation about whether later electric Pokémon like Shinx were inspired by this scrap design, or whether Kotora was simply a victim of the franchise's reluctance to have too many electric rodent and cub archetypes in a single generation. Fact 43. Even more startling than the unknown beta Pokémon was the discovery of what was cut from existing evolutionary lines. The Space World demo contained data for 4 Pokémon, without sprites, but with enough coding to establish their intended roles. They were supposed to be further evolutions of Yanma, Girafarig, Shuckle, and Piloswine. Of these, Yanma and Piloswine eventually did receive evolutions, Yanmega and Mamoswine, but not until Diamond and Pearl, a full decade later. Girafarig finally received an evolution in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, and Shuckle, as of this writing, remains the only one of the 4 whose evolution was designed in 1997 and has still never made it into a finished game. Fact 44. The beta demo also revealed that Gold and Silver originally had entirely different starter designs. The early Chikorita concept was significantly different in shape and expression from the creature that shipped. Early Cyndaquil had different proportions, and there was, in the demo, evidence of an early Fire-type starter that bore little resemblance to any final design, a creature that was replaced entirely during development. The starter Pokémon that define a generation are often among the first things that get locked in, but the Space World demo shows that even these anchor designs went through radical revision. Fact 45. The original name for Gold and Silver was not Gold and Silver. Early development documents and the demo itself used the title Pocket Monsters 2, the straightforward sequel naming convention that was eventually abandoned in favor of the Precious Stone naming system that became the franchise's signature. The name change, from numbered sequel to mineral-themed title, happened at some point during development, and it fundamentally changed how the franchise would be structured going forward, establishing the pattern of paired versions with distinct identities rather than a linear, numbered sequence. Fact 46. The first generation of Pokémon games also had significant cut content that has been partially recovered through leaked development documents. Early designs for Red and Green included scrapped evolutionary relatives for several Kanto species, a 3-stage evolution for Zubat that never made it in. Golbat did not gain Crobot until Gold and Silver, and various pre-evolutions for Pokémon like Vulpix, Meowth, Psyduck, and Ponyta that were never released. The scrapped pre-evolution designs suggest that Tajiri and Sugimori originally envisioned a more populated world with denser evolutionary trees. Fact 47. Gorochu is one of the most tantalizing of all scrapped Pokémon. Pikachu's original artist, Atsuko Nishida, revealed in 2018 that Pikachu was originally designed with a 3rd evolution, a frightening creature called Gorochu, with large fangs and a pair of demonic horns. The name Gorochu comes from the Japanese word Goro Goro, an onomatopoeia for thunder, continuing the naming pattern of Pikachu and Raichu. Gorochu was apparently cut because Tajiri felt the balance of Pikachu's evolutionary line worked better without it. But the creature existed, it was drawn, it had a name. And somewhere in the history of the franchise, there is a version of the world where Raichu evolves again into something monstrous. Fact 48. The beta materials for Pokémon Red and Green, analyzed through a combination of leaked assets and the work of researchers like Dr. Lava, showed that the original design for Scyther was significantly different from the creature that shipped an early sketch, depicted something closer to a bipedal lizard with large claws rather than a mantis with blade arms. The final Scyther design that players know is a dramatic departure from these early concepts, suggesting that the creature's identity was in genuine flux during development. Fact 49. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl also had a documented history of significant beta content, revealed through a behind-the-scenes DVD documentary from Game Freak that was later circulated online. This footage showed, among other things, a yellow-colored Shellos design. Shellos, in the finished games, appears in blue and pink forms, depending on the region, suggesting that a 3rd regional form was at one point considered. The documentary also showed early iterations of the Sinnoh starters at various design stages, including evidence that Infernape's final design was derived from an early concept involving a mandrill Pokémon that ultimately never shipped. Fact 50. The Sinnoh game's Great Marsh, the fourth generation's equivalent of the Safari Zone, originally had a much more elaborate design in early builds. Data miners working through the game's files have found map data and terrain coding that suggests the area was initially planned to be significantly larger, with more distinct subzones and a broader variety of ecological environments. The area was scaled back, almost certainly due to hardware constraints on the Nintendo DS, but the remnants of its grander vision are still buried in the code. Part 5. What they did not want you to see. Banned episodes and the anime's darkest chapters. The Pokémon anime has been running since April 1997, and across more than 1,300 episodes, it has had to navigate the specific challenge that all globally distributed children's media faces. The fact that what is acceptable in one culture is often completely unacceptable in another. Some of the franchise's most interesting history lives in the gaps in the episodes that were pulled, altered, suppressed, or simply never aired in certain markets. These are not just curiosity items. They are windows into the cultural assumptions that shaped how the franchise was presented to the world. Fact 51. Electric Soldier Porygon is the most infamous episode in the history of the Pokémon anime, and possibly in the history of children's television globally. It aired only once, on the 16th of December, 1997, on TV Tokyo. The episode features a sequence in which several missiles are destroyed by Pikachu's Thunderbolt, producing a rapid strobe effect of alternating red and blue frames. The effect triggered photosensitive epilepsy in a documented 685 Japanese children who were taken to hospitals with symptoms including seizures, blurred vision, dizziness, and nausea. The broader number of children who experienced symptoms but did not require hospitalization was reported to be in the thousands. The episode was never broadcast again, anywhere in the world, in its original form. Fact 52. The specific irony of the Porygon ban that followed the Electric Soldier Porygon incident is one of the franchise's most unjust quirks. The strobe effect that caused the seizures was produced by Pikachu's Thunderbolt attack, not by anything Porygon did. Porygon was simply present in the episode as a character, and yet Porygon, Porygon 2, and Porygon Z, the species and its two evolutions, have been effectively blacklisted from meaningful roles in the anime ever since, appearing only in brief background cameos. The franchise's most directly punished character was, mechanically speaking, innocent. Fact 53. The Legend of Dratini, the 35th episode of the original anime, was banned internationally not because of anything involving Dratini, but because of the firearms. In the episode, the Safari Zone warden points a revolver at Ash and his friends as a comedic threat. This was acceptable in Japan, where the tone reads as slapstick, but it was judged unacceptable for Western audiences, particularly American ones, where gun violence in children's media was receiving increased scrutiny in the late 1990s. The banning of this episode created one of the most confusing continuity gaps in the Western version of the show. Ash arrives at the Safari Zone and later claims he caught 30 Tauros there, but Western viewers never saw it happen. Those 30 Tauros simply appear one day in his collection, and for years, Western fans could not understand where they came from. Fact 54. Beauty and the Beach, the 18th episode, was skipped during the American initial run because it contained a scene in which James from Team Rocket competed in a beach beauty contest while wearing an inflatable bodysuit designed to give the appearance of a curvaceous female figure. The scene was cut from the international dub entirely. What makes this culturally interesting is the uneven editorial logic. This same episode contained a relatively dramatic battle sequence with a giant fantasy creature, which was kept. The depiction of a man in comedic disguise at a beauty contest was too much for Western broadcast standards in the late 1990s. A battle involving property destruction and fantasy violence was fine. Fact 55. The Jinx controversy is one of the more complex cases in the franchise's history of censorship. Jinx is a humanoid ice and psychic type that, in its original design, had jet black skin, exaggerated pink lips, and long blonde hair. The design drew criticism, particularly from American commentators, who pointed out its resemblance to offensive historical caricatures. The franchise's response was to redesign Jinx's skin from black to purple in all future appearances, and to quietly re-edit older episodes for DVD and streaming releases. The result is that depending on which version of a given episode you watch, Jinx looks different. Several holiday-themed episodes featuring Jinx were never re-aired in the West, and the episode The Ice Cave, from the Johto arc, in which Jinx plays a significant role, was never dubbed into English at all. Fact 56. South Korea banned more than 20 episodes of the Pokémon anime due to the country's historical stance against Japanese cultural influence in its media. Episodes featuring samurai characters, traditional Japanese festivals, scenes set in Japanese-styled architecture, and even depictions of Pokémon sumo wrestling were prohibited. This was not a response to any content in the Pokémon franchise specifically, but an application of broader cultural policy that affected Japanese imports across many media categories. The result is that Korean Pokémon fans of a certain generation have a meaningfully different viewing history of the original anime than their counterparts elsewhere in the world. Fact 57. In 2011, 2 episodes of the Best Wishes series, a 2-part arc involving Team Rocket and Team Plasma, were indefinitely postponed in Japan and then quietly skipped in the global broadcast. The reason was the timing. The episodes were scheduled to air 1 week after the catastrophic Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and they featured scenes of Pokémon causing large-scale destruction in an urban environment. The production team made the rapid decision to pull them. The episodes were eventually released online years later in a modified form, but the original intended context, airing as a dramatic mid-season confrontation, was lost forever. Fact 58. The Pokémon anime has been subject to ongoing editing, even beyond outright banning. In the original Japanese broadcasts, Brock's running gag of aggressive flirtation with every young woman he meets is played broadly for comedy. In the American dub, his advances are frequently softened, redirected, or cut entirely. In some international markets, Brock's scenes were altered to the point where his character motivation in specific episodes becomes difficult to follow. This kind of ongoing translation-level censorship means that the Brock who exists in English is a meaningfully different character from the Brock who exists in Japanese, more restrained, less defined by his comedic obsession, and in some ways, less fully realized. Fact 59. The Sun and Moon episode, Ash and Passimian, was banned in the West because the episode involves Ash putting on dark face paint to disguise himself as a Passimian, a Pokémon with dark fur, in order to join a group of them in a competitive challenge. The face paint, in context, constitutes blackface, regardless of the fictional in-world logic that drives it. The episode aired in Japan without controversy. It never aired in Western markets. This stands as one of the most recent examples of the anime's ongoing challenge of navigating cultural sensitivities that vary dramatically across its global audience. Fact 59.5. The relationship between the Pokémon anime and its Japanese source material is, across the show's entire run, more complicated and more interesting than most international fans realize. The Japanese version of the anime has a significantly different tone in specific scenes, not just in isolated controversial moments, but in the ongoing texture of how characters interact with each other. Brock's food preparation sequences are more elaborate and affectionately portrayed in Japan. Team Rocket's internal dynamic is given more psychological depth in certain Japanese-only dialogue scenes. And Ash in the Japanese version, named Satoshi after the franchise's creator, has moments of genuine strategic intelligence and emotional vulnerability that were sometimes softened or redirected in the English dub. The character international fans grew up with is a real and valid version of Ash, but he is a translation. The original is still out there, in Japanese broadcasts that most English-speaking fans have never watched. Fact 60. There exists a Pokémon anime short that almost no one outside Japan has ever seen, a theatrical short shown before certain Pokémon films in Japanese cinemas, featuring Meowth, Pikachu, and Wobbuffet stranded on a deserted island. The short has almost no dialogue, just the Pokémon vocalizations and ambient sound. It was described by those who saw it as an experimental, almost wordless meditation on survival and cooperation that felt remarkably different from the anime's usual format. It was never dubbed, never officially released internationally, and exists in the periphery of Pokémon media history as one of its most interesting footnotes. Part 6. Gods, Foxes, and Carp, the mythological roots of Pokémon design. Every designer draws from somewhere. Ken Sugimori and the other artists who have built the visual world of Pokémon over nearly 30 years have drawn from an enormous range of mythological, folkloric, biological, and cultural traditions, and the connections between the finished designs and their real-world inspirations are often richer and more specific than most players realize. Fact 61. Gyarados is one of the most direct mythological translations in the franchise. The giant sea serpent, notoriously typed as water and flying, despite looking nothing like a flying creature, is based on the Chinese legend of the Dragon Gate. In this myth, the Dragon Gate, Longmen, is a specific set of waterfalls on the Yellow River. Any carp that successfully leaps up over these falls is transformed into a dragon. The story is a metaphor for perseverance and transformation through hardship. Magikarp is the helpless, flopping carp. Gyarados is the dragon on the other side of the falls. And the story's specific moral, that apparent uselessness can conceal extraordinary potential, is what makes the Magikarp to Gyarados evolution one of the most emotionally satisfying transformations in the Fact of Naxivideos series. The original Pokémon Snap reinforces this mythology directly. There is a sequence in the game where players can knock a Magikarp into a waterfall, triggering its evolution into Gyarados. The waterfall is the Dragon Gate. Fact 62. Ninetales is a very nearly perfect translation of the Japanese concept of the kitsune, the supernatural fox spirit of Japanese folklore. Kitsune are believed to grow more powerful and more tails with age, with the most ancient and powerful kitsune possessing 9 tails. They are associated with wisdom, fire, shape-shifting, and deep spiritual power. Ninetales evolves from Vulpix, which has only 6 tails, correctly representing the kitsune's growth from a younger, less powerful state. Ninetales learns ghost-type moves, despite being a pure fire type, reflecting the kitsune's strong association with the spirit world. And the Pokédex entry in multiple games warns that cursing a Ninetales will bring 1,000 years of bad fortune, a direct reference to the kitsune's power to lay ancient, far-reaching curses on those who disrespect it. Fact 63. Arcanine is described in the Pokémon world as legendary, despite technically not being classified as a legendary Pokémon. This unusual designation has its roots in the creature's design, which draws from the Chinese and Ryukyuan tradition of Komainu, the guardian lion dog statues placed at the entrances of temples, shrines, and royal palaces across East Asia. These creatures, half lion and half dog in form, were thought to repel evil spirits and protect sacred spaces. Arcanine's mane, posture, and coloring directly reference these guardian figures, and in the anime, Arcanine appears alongside the 3 legendary birds on an ancient stone tablet as if it belongs in their company, as if the legendary designation is the memory of a time when the creature was understood to be something sacred. Fact 64. Meowth, the Team Rocket mascot, is directly inspired by the Maneki Neko, the Japanese lucky cat figurine that appears in shop windows and homes across Japan and, increasingly, across the world. The Maneki Neko is traditionally depicted with one paw raised in a beckoning gesture, a coin on its forehead, and a bell around its neck. Meowth has a coin on its forehead. It has a bell around its neck. Its raised paw directly references the Maneki Neko's iconic gesture, and the lucky cat is associated in Japanese culture with good fortune in business and commerce, which, combined with Team Rocket's criminal capitalism, gives Meowth a thematic coherence that most players never consciously register. Fact 65. The legendary dog trio of Gold and Silver, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, are based on the 3 mythological animals said to embody thunder, fire, and water in East Asian traditions. Raikou specifically draws from the Raiju, the thunder beast of Japanese mythology, which was sometimes depicted as a wolf or cat and was said to ride lightning to earth during storms. Entei draws from Chinese mythology's fire lion, and Suicune from the spirit of the north wind and clean water. The lore that the three were killed in the burning of the Brass Tower and resurrected by Ho-Oh adds a layer of tragedy to their divine status. They are gods who died, brought back by a greater god, marked forever by what they lost. Fact 66. Absol, the disaster warning Pokémon introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, draws from multiple East Asian traditions that associate specific animals with impending disaster. In Japanese and Chinese folklore, there are creatures, sometimes cats, sometimes more ambiguous forms, that are believed to sense coming earthquakes, floods, or other catastrophes, and behave strangely in the days before them. Absol's lore establishes that it appears before disasters not to cause them, but to warn people, and that humans, unable to understand this, have hunted it as a bad omen for generations. Absol is a creature condemned for being the messenger rather than the message. Fact 67. Lucario's design and lore draw substantially from the Egyptian god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity associated with death, the afterlife, and the weighing of souls. Anubis is typically depicted as a humanoid figure with the head of a jackal, wearing blue and gold, and carrying a staff. Lucario is a humanoid figure with jackal-like features, colored in blue and black, and channeling energy from its hands. The aura reading ability that defines Lucario's in-game and in-lore identity mirrors Anubis's role as a judge of souls, the being who perceives things about you that you cannot hide. Fact 68. Jirachi, the wish Pokémon of the third generation, is based on the Tanabata tradition, a Japanese festival celebrating the meeting of two star-crossed lovers, represented by the stars Vega and Altair, who can only cross the Milky Way to see each other once per year. In the Tanabata tradition, people write wishes on small pieces of paper and hang them from bamboo. Jirachi awakens once every 1,000 years to grant wishes, then returns to sleep. The creature's design, a small, star-shaped form with wish tags hanging from its head, is a direct visualization of the Tanabata paper wishes. Fact 69. Mew and Mewtwo's lore draws from one of the most specific real-world locations in the franchise's history. The Pokédex entries for Mew establish that it was discovered deep in the jungles of Guyana, in South America, a real country with real jungles. The Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island in Kanto, where the experiments that created Mewtwo were conducted, contains journals written by researchers who traveled to Guyana to find Mew. The specificity of this geographical detail is unusual for the franchise and gives the Mew mythology a grounded quality that makes the creature feel genuinely discovered rather than simply designed. Fact 69.5. Volcarona, the fire and bug type introduced in Pokémon Black and White, carries one of the most specific mythological identities in the franchise. Its Pokédex entry describes it as a creature that ancient civilizations worshipped as a substitute sun during periods of ash and darkness, specifically when volcanic eruptions blotted out the actual sun. This gives Volcarona a role in human history as a survival deity, not a monster or a power to be controlled, but something that people genuinely needed in order to have warmth and light. The creature is discovered in the deepest chamber of an ancient ruin, still alive after an indefinite period, which suggests it predates recorded history. Volcarona is not just inspired by mythology. Within the game's own lore, it is the thing that mythology was made about. Fact 70. Darkrai, the Dark-type legendary of Generation 4, is based on the concept of the Baku, a Japanese supernatural entity that devours dreams and nightmares. Historically, the Baku was invoked to consume bad dreams before they could linger. People would call out to the Baku after a nightmare and ask it to eat the dream. Darkrai's lore inverts this relationship, making it the creator of nightmares rather than their consumer. But the connection to the tradition of dream-eating supernatural entities is clear in its design and abilities. Part 7. Cardboard Gold, the wild history of the Pokémon TCG. The Pokémon trading card game launched in October 1996 in Japan, just 8 months after the original video games. Within 3 years, it had become one of the most successful trading card systems ever created, outselling even Magic, The Gathering in some markets. And within the history of that card game is a collection of stories about printing errors, rare cards, banned strategies, and legendary misprints that are as interesting as anything in the games themselves. Fact 71. The pre-release Raichu is the most mysterious card in the franchise's history. In 1999, Wizards of the Coast was running pre-release events across the United States to promote the Jungle expansion. Pre-release events involved distributing special promo cards stamped with the word pre-release to distinguish them from retail copies. During the production process, a printing error caused a small number of base set Raichu holo cards to receive the pre-release stamp, a stamp that should have appeared only on the Jungle Clefable promotional card. The Wizards staff who discovered the error distributed the wrongly stamped Raichus among themselves as keepsakes and never publicly acknowledged their existence. For years, the pre-release Raichu was considered a myth. People claimed to own them, but without documentation, the claims were impossible to verify. Wizards of the Coast gave conflicting statements when asked. It was not until a former employee produced photographic evidence in 2006 that the card's existence became undeniable. In 2025, a PSA-graded pre-release Raichu sold at Heritage Auctions for $550,000, making it the most expensive single English-language Pokémon card ever sold. Fact 72. The Pikachu Illustrator card is the most valuable individual Pokémon card in existence. It was not a product for sale. It was a prize awarded to winners of the first Japanese Pokémon card game official tournament in 1998. The card features custom artwork and bears the title Pokémon Illustrator rather than a trainer or energy title. Only a handful were ever produced, and the number in circulation is believed to be fewer than 40. In 2022, social media personality Logan Paul purchased a PSA 10 graded Pikachu Illustrator for $5.27 million. He wore it to a wrestling event on a chain around his neck. In September 2025, another PSA 9 copy sold on eBay for $4 million. The Pikachu Illustrator exists at an intersection of absolute rarity, cultural significance, and the kind of collector mania that turns a piece of cardboard into a financial instrument. Fact 73. In the late 1990s, during the peak of the Pokémon card boom in the United States, a rumor spread among children that psychic-type cards were cursed. The source of the rumor appears to have been a combination of the purple color scheme of psychic cards and the relatively sinister artwork on creatures like Gengar and Haunter. Children began refusing to include psychic cards in their decks, refusing to trade for them, and in some cases throwing them away. Wizards of the Coast released statements debunking the rumor, but it persisted in school playgrounds across the country for months. It is one of the purest examples of Pokémon's capacity to generate urban mythology from almost nothing. A color became a superstition, and a superstition became a genuine behavioral pattern. Fact 74. The error card market in the Pokémon TCG is one of its most fascinating subcultures. There are documented printing errors that range from minor color shifts in backgrounds, to cards that were printed with the wrong text entirely, to cards that have foil patterns on surfaces where they should not appear. One notable category of error involves the stamped movie promo cards distributed during the first Pokémon film. Mewtwo, Electabuzz, Pikachu, and Dragonite were given out with a gold Pokémon, the first movie stamp, in the upper right corner. A small number of these cards had the stamp printed upside down in the lower left corner instead. These inverted stamp error cards are significantly rarer than their correctly stamped counterparts and can command several $100s in good condition. Fact 75. The Ancient Mew promo card, distributed during screenings of Pokémon 2000 in Japanese cinemas, was the subject of one of the most unusual competitive banning decisions in the TCG's history. The card was written in a stylized script designed to look like an ancient language, which it was. The text was in archaic Futhark runes and medieval Latin. When translators decoded the text, they discovered that in certain competitive formats, the card's mechanics created extreme strategic imbalances. It was banned from organized tournament play before most Western players had even seen it. The card became primarily decorative, a beautiful object that most people assumed was purely cosmetic and would never know could have been played at all. Fact 76. The base set Charizard, the holographic first edition version, has become one of the most culturally loaded objects in the franchise's history. In 2021, Logan Paul paid $220,000 for a pristine first edition base set Charizard at auction. A moment that received mainstream news coverage and helped trigger the most significant boom in Pokémon card prices since the original 1999 craze. The card itself is not mechanically powerful. By competitive standards, 120 damage for 3 fire energy was strong in 1999, but is completely outclassed by modern Pokémon. Its value is entirely cultural, a perfect storm of nostalgia, scarcity, and the specific emotional weight that Charizard carries as the franchise's most iconic non-mascot Pokémon. Fact 77. The Tropical Mega Battle cards, distributed at a now legendary 1,999 invitation-only tournament held in Honolulu, Hawaii, are among the rarest in the English-language TCG. The tournament invited the top Pokémon players from regions across the globe, and the promotional cards distributed there were never available through any retail channel. The tropical beach illustration on these cards has since been reprinted for other promotional purposes, but the original 1,999 prints remain extraordinarily rare, with individual cards commanding prices in the thousands of dollars in good condition. Fact 78. The no rarity symbol error is one of the more widespread printing errors in the original base set, and one that many collectors own without knowing it. During the initial print run of the base set in Japan, certain cards were produced without the set's rarity symbol, the black circle, diamond, or star that appears in the lower right corner of each card to indicate how rare it is. These no-symbol variants are meaningfully different from the standard prints, and are among the most common error cards that people do not realize they have sitting in old binders. Fact 79. The Pokémon card game was almost not published outside Japan. The decision to bring the TCG to North America was made in part because of the already explosive success of the video games, and the American localization was handled by Wizards of the Coast, at the time the publisher of Magic the Gathering, rather than by Nintendo or Game Freak directly. The Wizards of the Coast era of the Pokémon TCG lasted from 1998 to 2003, and the cards produced during this period, with their distinctive energy, color schemes, and card layouts, are what most adults who grew up in the late 1990s remember as the real Pokémon cards. In 2003, Nintendo terminated the Wizards of the Coast licensing agreement and took the TCG in-house, producing it through what became the Pokémon Company. The transition caused significant disruption in the competitive scene and altered the visual language of the cards in ways that still occasionally generate heated debate in collector circles. Fact 80. The highest possible print quality for a graded Pokémon card is a PSA 10, colloquially called a gem mint. The criteria for this grade are extraordinarily strict: 4 perfectly sharp corners, perfectly centered card face within a defined tolerance, no print imperfections visible under low magnification, and pristine surface condition on both front and back. Because of the printing conditions of 1990s manufacturing, achieving a PSA 10 on an original base set card requires that the card essentially came out of the pack perfect and was stored immediately in pristine conditions. The proportion of original base set cards that can achieve a PSA 10 is vanishingly small, which is why the price gap between a PSA 9 and PSA 10 for key cards can be enormous, sometimes representing hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference for the same card in different conditions. Part 8. The hidden architecture of battle competitive mechanics that the games never told you. Most people who played Pokémon as children knew the basics: type matchups, evolution, held items. But beneath the surface of the games, invisible to almost every casual player, is an entire second layer of systems, numerical, invisible, deeply designed, that determines how strong your Pokémon actually is, and why 2 Pikachus raised in different ways will perform completely differently in battle. Fact 81. Every single Pokémon in the franchise has 6 hidden numerical values embedded in its data from the moment it is generated, whether caught in the wild, hatched from an egg, or received through a trade. These are called individual values, or IVs. Each IV ranges from 0 to 31, one for each of the 6 stats: HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. 2 Pikachus of the same level and nature will have different actual stats if they have different IVs. A Pikachu with a speed 4 of 31 will be measurably faster than a Pikachu with a speed 4 of 0. IVs cannot be seen in the game, at least not in the early generations, and they cannot be changed after the Pokémon is generated. They are genetic. The implications of this system are significant. It means that two players who both say they train their Pokémon perfectly can be competing with genuinely unequal creatures through no fault of either player's strategy. It means that a player who wins a gym battle partly does so because of randomness built into the numbers before the game even began. And it means that the competitive scene, once players discovered this system, became about breeding, about producing offspring with the exact IV spreads that maximize the specific stats a given Pokémon needed to perform optimally in battle. Fact 82. Effort values, or EVs, are the complement to IVs. Where IVs are fixed at the moment of a Pokémon's creation and cannot be changed, EVs are earned through battle and can be deliberately shaped. Every time a Pokémon defeats another Pokémon in battle, it earns a small number of EVs in a specific stat, determined by the species of the defeated Pokémon. Defeating a Magikarp gives 1 speed EV. Defeating a Machop gives 1 attack EV. Defeating a Blissey gives 2 HP EVs. A Pokémon can accumulate a maximum of 510 EVs in total, with no more than 252 in any single stat. Every 4 EVs in a stat translate to 1 additional stat point at level 100. The result is a system where the way you train your Pokémon, which opponents you fight, how many of them, in what order, shapes its final numerical form. A Machamp trained entirely by fighting speed-giving Pokémon will have abnormally high speed for its species. A Machamp trained entirely on attack-giving opponents will hit harder than average. Most players in the early games had no idea this was happening. They fought whatever Pokémon they encountered. They were accidentally EV training, just in random, suboptimal ways. Fact 83. Natures were introduced in Generation 3, Ruby and Sapphire, and represent the third hidden layer of Pokémon optimization. Every Pokémon has one of 25 possible natures, and 20 of those natures increase one stat by 10%, while decreasing another by 10%. A jolly nature boosts speed at the expense of special attack. A modest nature boosts special attack at the expense of attack. The remaining 5 natures, hardy, bashful, docile, quirky, and serious, are neutral, producing no changes to any stat. Natures are visible in the summary screen and affect how stats appear numerically, but most casual players never engage with them as a strategic consideration. Fact 84. One of the most counterintuitive competitive mechanics in the franchise involves the move Burn. Most players understand that burning a Pokémon gradually drains its HP over time. What many players in early generations did not know is that Burn also reduces the burned Pokémon's physical attack stat by half. This makes Burn one of the most powerful strategic tools against physical attackers. It simultaneously weakens them and chips their health every turn. A player who knows this can deliberately attempt to burn a physically oriented opponent, not primarily for the damage, but to cripple their offensive output. A player who does not know this sees Burn as just damage over time and misses its actual strategic depth. Fact 85. The hidden power mechanic introduced in Generation 2 is one of the most elegant and bizarre systems in the franchise. Hidden power is a normal type move by default, but its actual type and base power are determined by the user's IV spread. A Pokémon with a specific combination of IVs in certain stats will produce a hidden power of a specific type: fire, ice, electric, or any of the other types. Because IVs are different for every Pokémon has a potentially unique hidden power. This system meant that certain IV spreads were preferred not just for the stat benefits they provided, but for the hidden power type they produced. A Pokémon bred for perfect attack, special attack, speed, defense, and special defense 4s, with specific configurations of other IVs, could simultaneously have a 70 base power, hidden power, of a desirable type. The mechanic was complex enough that it effectively created an invisible sublayer of competitive breeding decisions. Fact 86. The physical special split is one of the most significant mechanical changes in the franchise's history, and it was introduced in Generation 4, Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. Before Diamond and Pearl, whether a move was a physical move using the attack stat or a special move using the special attack stat, was determined by the move's type, not by the move's actual mechanics. Fire moves were always special. Normal moves were always physical. Flying moves were always physical. This created absurd situations where Gengar with terrible defense and HP but excellent special defense was essentially immune to the most common normal and fighting moves of the era, simply because of how those moves were categorized. In Diamond and Pearl, this changed. Each individual move was reclassified based on its actual function rather than its type. Moves that projected energy or elemental force became special. Moves that involved physical contact became physical. Overnight, the competitive meta changed dramatically. Gyarados, previously limited by its inability to use its massive attack stat for water-type moves, which were all special, could suddenly unleash its full physical power through its natural-type moves. Gengar, previously a nigh untouchable attacker, became significantly more vulnerable to physical moves of appropriate types. Fact 87. One of the most poorly understood mechanics in the early Pokémon games is the stat experience system, the Generation 1 and 2 precursor to EVs. In red, blue, yellow, gold, and silver, every Pokémon you defeat gives your Pokémon a small amount of what the game internally calls stat experience in that defeated Pokémon's primary stat. This stat experience accumulates invisibly and translates into small stat bonuses that grow over time. The critical difference between stat experience and modern EVs is the lack of a cap. In the original games, there is theoretically no upper limit to how much stat experience a Pokémon can accumulate, though the actual stat benefit caps out at a ceiling. This means a Pokémon that fought thousands of high-yield opponents could accumulate enormous hidden benefits that would not be visible in any in-game display. Fact 88. The concept of egg moves, moves that a Pokémon can only learn if it hatches from an egg where one parent knew the move and was compatible, was introduced in Generation 2 and is one of the most elegant pieces of design in the bladder. Competitive ecosystem. Certain moves are not available in any TM or level-up list for a given species, but can be passed down through breeding from a compatible species that does learn the move. This creates a network of knowledge, inheritance, across species boundaries. A Smeargle breeding with almost anything can pass down Sketch, allowing access to any move in the game if the chain is constructed carefully enough. The egg move system rewards players who understand the connections between species and have the patience to engineer specific breeding sequences. Fact 89. Trick Room is a move introduced in Generation 4 that reverses the speed order of all Pokémon in battle, meaning that the slowest Pokémon acts first and the fastest acts last. The game's own code has a speed calculation that makes Trick Room interact unexpectedly with very high-speed Pokémon. Deoxys S, with the highest base speed stat of any Pokémon, has a speed stat at level 50 that exceeds a certain threshold in the game's internal speed calculation. The result is that under Trick Room, Deoxys S actually moves before slower Pokémon again. It loops back around to being first, even in the reversed environment. This is not intentional design. It is an artifact of the mathematics of how Trick Room is coded. Fact 89.5. The speed tie mechanic in competitive Pokémon is one of those rules that most players never think about until it costs them a match. When two Pokémon have exactly the same speed stat, whether through natural stats, EVs, natures, or any combination, the game determines which one moves first by a genuine coin flip. A 50-50 random roll, no priority, no tiebreaker beyond chance. This means that in a high-level competitive match between two perfectly optimized Pokémon of the same speed tier, the outcome of a critical moment can be decided by randomness that neither player can control or predict. The existence of this mechanic means that building for speed ties is a legitimate and sometimes terrifying strategic gamble. You might as well flip a coin for the most important turn of the game. Fact 90. The Azurill to Marill evolution is responsible for one of the franchise's most accidentally hilarious gender-swapping phenomena. 3/4 of all Azurill are female 75%, but only half of all Marill are female. When Azurill evolves into Marill, the game does not carry the gender forward, it recalculates. Because of the difference in gender ratios between the two species and the way that gender is internally tied to a specific hidden numerical value called the personality value. 1 out of every 3 female Azurill that evolves becomes a male Marill. This is not a glitch. It is the predictable outcome of a design decision made without full consideration of its implications. Azurill evolves and spontaneously changes gender at a rate that, in any biological context, would be extraordinary. Part 9. The Gold and Silver Deep Cuts Generation 2's Buried Treasures. Pokémon Gold and Silver are widely regarded as the high watermark of the franchise's handheld era. The games that expanded every system, added real-time clocks, introduced breeding, and then gave players an entire second region as a reward for finishing the story. But even these beloved games contain layers of hidden content, scrapped features, and design decisions that most players never knew existed. Fact 91. The real-time clock in Gold and Silver, the mechanic that tracks actual days and hours, and uses them to determine which Pokémon appear, which shops have specific items, and what time of day events are available, nearly did not make it into the final games. The Game Boy Color had limited memory, and storing multiple palette configurations for each map at different times of day pushed the hardware to its limits. Developers debated cutting the feature entirely for most of the game's development cycle. The decision to keep it was made relatively late and required significant optimization to implement without crashing the hardware. If that call had gone the other way, features like the day-night cycle in Animal Crossing, which developers have cited as being directly influenced by Gold and Silver's real-time clock, might not exist in the form they do today. Fact 92. The bug-catching contest in the National Park of Johto was originally designed to be more elaborate than what shipped. Early builds of the game included rare Pokémon that could only be obtained by winning the contest with very high scores, not just the items and sunstones that made it into the final version. These exclusive prize Pokémon were removed before release, likely to avoid locking rare creatures behind a skill-based competition that some players might find too difficult or frustrating. The leftover data for these prize Pokémon remains in the game's code, a tantalizing ghost of the more ambitious system that was once planned. Fact 93. Pokémon Gold and Silver originally included a milk delivery side quest involving Miltank, the normal-type cow Pokémon. Players would have been able to transport a specialized item called Moo Moo Milk between NPCs in different towns, earning money and items as rewards. The mechanic was described by developers as feeling too repetitive and as interrupting the natural flow of the main story, and it was cut before release. Interestingly, the concept seems to have inspired a small reference in Generation 6 delivery characters in the Kalos region mention carrying milk as part of their work, a quiet nod to the scrapped Johto feature from 15 years earlier. Fact 94. The Battle Tower in Pokémon Crystal, the first competitive battling facility outside of the game's main storyline, was not originally conceived as a battle location at all. It began as an AI testing environment. Game Freak developers wanted a space where they could run their AI opponent trainers against unusual strategies, forcing the system to respond to things it had not encountered in the main game. The facility was effective enough as an AI challenge that it was repurposed as player content. The decision to let players enter the testing environment and fight the AI directly eventually grew into the Battle Frontier and the entire tradition of competitive post-game facilities that defines the franchise's modern approach to endgame content. Fact 95. The Johto games removed the Safari Zone from the game's content entirely, which was controversial among fans of the feature. But data miners who explored the Gold and Silver code found evidence that a Safari Zone was coded into the Johto region during development and simply removed before the games shipped. The map data is there. The trigger conditions are partially there. Something that could have been a Johto Safari Zone exists in the game as a ghost of an excised feature, accessible only through cheat devices and memory manipulation. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the 2009 remakes, restored a full Safari Zone to the Johto experience nearly 15 years after the feature was cut. Fact 96. The friendship mechanic, introduced in Gold and Silver, which determines whether certain Pokémon will evolve and how much their move's power varies, has a hidden optimization that most players stumbled into without knowing it. The game calculates friendship gains in steps taken, but the specific way the calculation is structured means that walking exactly 256 steps produces a more efficient friendship gain than walking any other number. Players who moved in 256-step intervals between other activities were, accidentally, maximizing their friendship-building efficiency. Togepi, Espeon, and Umbreon, the primary friendship evolution Pokémon of Gold and Silver, could be leveled more efficiently by players who happen to walk in the right rhythm, without any of them knowing why. Fact 97. The Unown, introduced in Gold and Silver, were originally intended to have a more direct narrative connection to the legendary Pokémon Arceus. Development notes from the games reveal that Unown were designed as an early hint at the Pokémon who would later be revealed as the franchise's creator deity. Not until Generation 4 did Arceus appear explicitly. The shared themes of ancient writing, mysterious power, and connection to the very structure of reality are not coincidental. The ruins of Alph, where Unown are found, are seeded with puzzles and architecture that suggest a much larger and more explicit lore connection than the games ever make clear. The ambiguity was a choice, but the intention was there from the beginning. Fact 98. In Pokémon Gold and Silver, the internal code refers to the Unown species as Unknown A, Unknown B, Unknown C, and so on through the alphabet. This is unremarkable. But the early development files also include placeholder sprites for additional Unown forms, representing punctuation marks, a question mark, an exclamation point, and others that were not included in the original Gold and Silver release. The punctuation mark Unown were eventually added in Fire Red and Leaf Green, a decade after they were first designed. They existed in placeholder form in 1999 and waited patiently until 2004 to make their debut. Part 10. The world you walk through Pokémon regions and their real-world counterparts. One of the deepest pleasures of exploring the Pokémon franchise is the realization that the world of the games is not entirely invented. Every region from Kanto to Paldea is based on a real geographical area, and the design choices that went into each one reflect a genuine engagement with the landscapes, cultures, and histories of those places. Fact 99. Kanto is the most literally named region in the franchise. The Kanto region in Japan is the real-world area surrounding Tokyo, and its name appears in the game without modification. The geographical layout of the game's Kanto, the positioning of its cities, the shape of its routes, the location of its bodies of water mirrors the real Kanto region's geography, with enough accuracy that fans have created detailed overlay maps, demonstrating the correspondence. Saffron City, the largest and most commercially important city in the game, aligns geographically with Tokyo. Vermilion City, the port town, corresponds roughly to Yokohama. The Safari Zone's location aligns with real nature preserves in the region. Fact 100. Johto is based on the Kansai region of Japan, the area that includes Kyoto, Osaka, and Nara. The Kansai region is, in Japanese cultural terms, the historical and spiritual heartland of the country, the place where the oldest temples, the oldest traditions, and the oldest art forms are concentrated. This is precisely why Johto feels older, more mystical, and more deeply connected to history than Kanto. The Johto games are saturated with shrine aesthetics, ancient architecture, and a sense of cultural depth that reflects their real-world inspiration. Ecruteak City, the game's most historically resonant location home to the Bell Tower and the burned Brass Tower, corresponds in feeling and position to Kyoto. Fact 101. Unova, introduced in Black and White, was the first mainline Pokémon region not based on a location in Japan. It was based on New York City and its surrounding metropolitan area, including parts of New Jersey. Castelia City, the massive, glittering metropolis in the center of Unova, is designed to evoke Manhattan, with skyscrapers, busy piers, and the specific energy of a city that never fully quiets. Nimbasa City, the entertainment hub, corresponds to the theater and entertainment districts of Midtown. Even the shape of the Unova map, when compared to the shape of the New York metropolitan area, reveals a clear geographical correspondence. The choice of New York as an inspiration was a significant tonal decision. Unova is the most urban, the most culturally diverse, and the most morally complex of the game regions, and those qualities reflect the city it was built to evoke. Fact 102. Kalos, the setting of X and Y, is based on northern France, specifically the area around Paris and the surrounding territories. Lumiose City, the central hub of Kalos, is designed to look exactly like Paris when viewed from above, a radial design with streets converging at a central tower, closely matching the Parisian street plan centered on the Eiffel Tower. The Tower of Mastery in Lumiose City occupies the same position in the game's geography that the Eiffel Tower occupies in Paris. The development team at Game Freak made numerous research trips to France in preparation for the game, and the region is filled with architectural and cultural details drawn directly from their observations. Fact 103. Alola, introduced in Sun and Moon, is based on the Hawaiian Islands, a deliberate choice that reflected Game Freak's interest in exploring a non-continental, tropical island ecosystem. The Alola region consists of 4 main islands and 1 smaller artificial island, mirroring Hawaii's island chain structure. The culture of Alola, its traditions, its relationship with the land, its concept of Aina as sacred ground, draws on Hawaiian and broader Polynesian cultural traditions. The Tapu guardians of each island, beings of primal protective power bound to specific sacred spaces, are directly inspired by Hawaiian and Pacific Island mythological traditions of place-based protective deities. Fact 104. Galar, the setting of Sword and Shield, is based on the United Kingdom, specifically Great Britain, depicted upside down. The southern portion of Galar corresponds to England, with industrial landscapes, rolling countryside, and architectural styles drawn from different periods of British history. The northern regions of the game correspond to Scotland, becoming wilder and more rugged as the player progresses. The sports culture of Galar, specifically the way Pokémon battles are conducted as massive stadium spectacles watched by enormous crowds, directly reflects the British relationship with football soccer as the defining national sport and cultural institution. Fact 105. Paldea, introduced in Scarlet and Violet, is based on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal, with particular emphasis on the landscapes of Andalusia in southern Spain. The terrain of Paldea, with its central plateau, its olive groves, its red soil, and its combination of modern and ancient architecture, is a clear love letter to Spanish geography. The game's central city, Messagoza, has the feel of a Spanish university city, a living palimpsest of different architectural periods layered over each other. Game Freak's design research trips to Spain are visible in nearly every environmental detail of the region. Part 11. What Almost Was, the anime's greatest what-ifs. The Pokémon anime has been shaped as much by the decisions its writers and producers chose not to make as by the ones they did. Across nearly 3 decades and more than 1,300 episodes, there are dozens of documented cases where major creative directions were considered and abandoned alternative versions of the story that existed long enough to be written down and then never came to be. Fact 106. Ash was never supposed to be the protagonist. During the pitch process for the anime, the producers seriously considered making the female companion the character who would become Misty, the central trainer of the story. In this version, Misty would have caught and battled Pokémon, while Ash played a supporting role. This arrangement was abandoned when television executives decided that a male protagonist would perform better in the international market, specifically in the American market, which was expected to be the franchise's most important Western target. The decision was market research, not storytelling instinct. Fact 107. Even after Ash was established as the protagonist, the original plan for his starter Pokémon was not Pikachu. Early anime storyboards and pre-production materials show Clefairy as the intended partner Pokémon for Ash. The manga adaptation that predated the anime Pokémon Pocket Monsters used Clefairy as the protagonist's main partner for exactly this reason. Pikachu replaced Clefairy at a relatively late stage of pre-production, after character testing revealed that Pikachu's design was more broadly appealing across both genders and demographics than Clefairy's. The yellow color and the electricity also made for more visually exciting battle sequences. Fact 108. The original plan for the Indigo League finale had Ash winning. Actual scripts were drafted in which Ash defeated his opponents in the tournament's final rounds and became the Indigo League champion. The decision to make him lose to Richie, a new character introduced specifically for the tournament arc, was made by executives who worried that the story would lose narrative momentum if the protagonist achieved his stated goal too early. Making Ash lose created the template for every subsequent regional journey, always improving, always competitive, never quite making it. Ash eventually did win a regional championship, but not until the Alola League in Sun and Moon, more than 20 years after losing to Richie. Fact 109. Brock was not supposed to stay with the group past the Indigo League. The writer's original plan was to cycle through gym leaders as traveling companions, giving each region's gym leaders an extended role as partners before handing off to the next. Brock's chemistry with Ash and Misty made him too popular to rotate out, and the writers abandoned the cycling companion concept in favor of keeping him as a permanent fixture. This decision established one of the anime's most defining structural choices, the idea that Ash would have two consistent companions rather than a rotating cast. Fact 110. The writers genuinely considered killing the SS Anne. Early drafts of the battle aboard the Street Anne two-part episode included the ship sinking with no survivors, a genuine dark moment that would have put Ash, Misty, and Brock in mortal danger with no guaranteed escape. The decision to soften this ending was made because of concerns about how such a dramatically dark moment would land with the show's young audience. But the production team kept some of the dramatic weight the ship does capsize, and the episode has a genuine quality of danger and disorientation that even the softened version retains. Fact 111. Charizard's disobedience arc, one of the most memorable extended storylines of the original anime, was originally planned to resolve much more quickly. The writers intended Charizard's refusal to obey Ash as a running gag rather than an emotional arc, something to be acknowledged and moved past within a few episodes. The character became so interesting, so full of personality and contradiction, that the creative team found themselves writing around it, building an arc of mutual respect and eventual reconciliation that played out over years of episodes. The writers kept Charizard around far longer than planned and gave it redemption arcs in Johto and beyond that were never in any original outline. Fact 112. Team Rocket almost got their own spin-off series. By the late stages of the original Kanto and Orange Islands arcs, Jessie, James, and Meowth had become so popular in some markets, more beloved than Ash himself, that the production team began developing a concept for an animated series centered on the trio without Ash. The premise would have followed them pursuing their own goals after leaving Giovanni's organization. The project was dropped in favor of keeping them as recurring antagonists, but the degree to which it was developed suggests the creative team genuinely considered it as a viable concept. Fact 113. Ash's Butterfree departure. The episode Bye Bye Butterfree, in which Ash releases his Butterfree to mate with a pink. Butterfree was originally written as a death. Early drafts framed Butterfree staying with its mate and then never returning as a much more explicitly final farewell, with language suggesting that the character had reached the end of its story in the most absolute sense. The tonal change from death to bittersweet goodbye was deliberate. The writers wanted the emotional impact of loss without the finality of mortality. The episode is still one of the most emotionally resonant in the franchise's history, and its restraint may be part of why. Fact 114. Gary Oak's eventual career as a Pokemon researcher, the role he occupies when he reappears in later arcs of the anime, was not planned from the beginning. Early concept notes described Gary as eventually becoming a co-protagonist after losing the Indigo League, traveling alongside Ash in a somewhat reformed state. This idea was abandoned in favor of keeping him as a rival, but when Gary did eventually undergo his character evolution in the Johto era, the writers used the researcher path as a way to honor the general idea of his growth without requiring his constant presence. Fact 115. The Pokemon anime almost ended after its first year of production. The production team going into the show was not confident it would be renewed beyond the initial Indigo League arc, and planning documents from this period treat the Indigo League finale as a potential series conclusion, with Ash returning home to Pallet Town as the story's endpoint. The extraordinary commercial success of the franchise forced a renewal that the team was not entirely prepared for, which is one of the reasons the transition from the Indigo League to the Orange Islands felt somewhat improvised by the standards of later seasons. Part 12. Generations 4 through 9, The Secrets of the Modern Era. As the franchise expanded through its more recent generations, it grew more complex, more ambitious, and more willing to experiment with both mechanics and narrative. But with greater complexity comes greater amounts of hidden content mechanics the games never fully explain, design decisions with unexpected depth, and scrapped features whose ghosts remain visible in released code. Fact 116. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl's Spiritomb required those 32 underground conversations to capture normally, but few players knew about the specific mechanic that Spiritomb's design was referencing. Spiritomb's Pokédex entries describe it as a binding of 108 malevolent spirits captured in a special stone called the Odd Keystone. The number 108 appears in Buddhist tradition as a sacred number, representing the number of earthly temptations that must be overcome to achieve enlightenment. A Buddhist prayer rosary traditionally has 108 beads. The 108 bound souls of Spiritomb are directly referencing this tradition, which gives the creature's design a specific cultural and spiritual weight that most Western players are unaware of. Fact 117. The Underground in Diamond and Pearl had a multiplayer scavenger hunt mechanic that was cut before the game shipped. Players were supposed to be able to bury items in the Underground's terrain, which other players connected via the DS wireless functions could then discover and dig up. This would have created a genuine asynchronous multiplayer ecosystem within the Underground, where the items you found would depend on what other players in your network had buried. The mechanic was removed, likely due to concerns about item economy, balance, and the difficulty of preventing players from simply burying and redigging their own items. The spirit of the feature appeared years later in the expanded Underground of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Fact 118. The PokeWatch, the watch-like device introduced in Diamond and Pearl with multiple apps, had an unused application buried in its code, a real-world alarm clock. This app would have allowed players to set a time for the Nintendo DS to sound an alarm using a Pokémon cry of their choice. The feature was removed before release, most likely because of concerns about battery drain. Leaving the DS in sleep mode with an alarm set would have significantly reduced battery life in a device that was already a somewhat modest performer on that metric. But the coding framework for it remained in the game files, discoverable by anyone who looked. Fact 119. Pokémon Black and White are widely regarded as the most narratively ambitious main series games, partly because of Team Plasma's explicitly philosophical challenge to the franchise's core premise. N's argument that keeping Pokémon in Pokéballs is a form of imprisonment, that battle is exploitation, that humans and Pokémon cannot truly be partners in a relationship built on capture and dominance is taken seriously enough by the game that it creates genuine discomfort. What most players do not know is that early drafts of Black and White went significantly further. Some gym leaders were scripted to explicitly agree with N's position. The argument was supposed to be more genuinely destabilizing than the final version, which ultimately comes down firmly on the side of traditional human-Pokémon bonding. The more challenging version was toned down before release, but the residue of its ambition remains in how the game handles moral questions relative to any other entry in the series. Fact 120. The season system in Black and White, which changes the visual appearance and available Pokémon of the entire world on a monthly schedule tied to the real-world calendar, had a planned extension that never shipped. Unused dialogue files in the game reference special weather events that would have included things like region-wide sandstorms and blizzards that blocked access to specific routes for extended periods. These seasonal extreme weather events would have radically changed the experience of playing the game in certain months of the year. The feature was apparently deemed too complex to balance and too potentially frustrating. Imagine not being able to access a route you needed because of a month-long blizzard, and it was cut. Fact 121. Pokémon X and Y introduced Mega Evolution, a mechanic that allows certain Pokémon to transform into more powerful forms during battle. What most players did not know was that Mega Evolution was originally designed as a permanent transformation, a genuine evolution that would have left the Pokémon in its Mega form indefinitely. This would have changed the entire balance of the game's post-game content dramatically. The decision to make Mega Evolution temporary reverting at the end of each battle was made specifically to preserve competitive balance and to give the mechanic dramatic tension. A player choosing when to activate a Mega Evolution during a battle has a strategic decision to make. A player whose Pokémon is permanently Mega Evolved does not. Fact 122. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, there is unused dialogue for the character Lusamane that refers to each Ultra Beast by a unique individual name rather than the species designation, UB01, UB02, and so on used in the final game. This suggests that at an earlier point in development, the Ultra Beasts were conceived as genuinely unique individuals, unique entities, rather than catchable species. The shift from unique individuals to catchable rare species fundamentally changed what the Ultra Beasts mean within the story, turning them from something more like legendary Pokémon into something closer to invasive creatures that the player hunts down as a post-game activity. Fact 123. The Poké-Pelago mechanic in Sun and Moon, the minigame island chain where stored Pokémon can gather items, train, or find berries, had a planned extension that never made it into the final game. Data miners found evidence of a mini-adventure feature that would have sent Pokémon on short narrative excursions, returning with text descriptions of the things they encountered. These would have been brief procedurally generated stories. A Growlithe finds a berry in a cave. A Slowpoke spends 3 hours staring at a pond. The feature was cut, likely due to time constraints, but its traces in the code suggest that Sun and Moon were genuinely interested in giving the stored Pokémon in the box a sense of independent life. Fact 124. The camping mechanic in Sword and Shield, which allows players to set up a camp and interact with their Pokémon while cooking, contains rare and deeply hidden reaction animations for specific Pokémon. Some of these animations only trigger with a probability of around 1 in several hundred interactions. There are specific cooking sequences that produce unique responses from individual Pokémon species, animations of them refusing to eat or playing with the food, or stealing pieces of the curry before the cooking is finished. These animations were clearly crafted with care and specificity, and the vast majority of players will never see them simply because they do not spend enough time in the camping interface for the rare outcomes to surface. Fact 125. The wild area in Sword and Shield, the semi-open world zone with roaming Pokémon and dynamic weather, was not a new idea. Game Freak had been working towards something like it since at least Generation 3, when internal development documents describe experiments with open-world Pokémon exploration that the Game Boy Advance hardware could not support. The concept was tested in various forms throughout the DS and 3DS eras, but consistently ran into hardware limitations. The wild area represents the first time the concept was realizable, and its design philosophy, a large contiguous space with variable weather and encounter rates, fed directly into the full open-world approach of Legends, Arceus, and Scarlet and Violet. Fact 126. Pokémon Go had trading functionality coded into the game from its launch, years before trading was actually implemented. Data miners, who dug through the app's initial release code, found menu structures, UI frameworks, and variable definitions that were clearly the skeleton of a trading system. The feature was not ready for launch. Server infrastructure could not support the peer-to-peer transaction volume that trading would generate, and it was left in the code in dormant form until the actual implementation could catch up. Trading was finally launched in June 2018, nearly 2 years after the app's initial release. Fact 127. Pokémon Go also had a much more elaborate version of its Pokémon fleeing mechanic planned before launch. Wild Pokémon were originally supposed to physically move away from the player's location in the real world, meaning players would need to physically walk to follow them. This was scrapped entirely after the development team realized it would create dangerous situations, specifically children running into traffic trying to catch a Pokémon that was moving toward a busy street. The final flee mechanic, where a Pokémon simply disappears from the encounter screen, is a significant safety compromise relative to what was originally designed. Fact 128. The Legends Arceus game. The semi-open world prehistoric Sinnoh game, released in 2022, represents the most literal return to the franchise's founding idea of anything Game Freak has published. The core gameplay loop is catching Pokémon in the wild, observing them, researching their behaviors, and building a catalog of knowledge about them which is, as precisely as game design can approximate it, what Satoshi Tajiri was doing as a child on the banks of those ponds in Machida. The game strips away almost everything that has accreted around Pokémon since 1996 and returns to the act of observation and capture as its own sufficient pleasure. Fact 129. Scarlet and Violet's Paldea region introduced the concept of Area Zero, a massive geological crater at the center of the map, where the most ancient and mysterious phenomena of the region concentrate. The design of Area Zero is explicitly a reference to the Hollow Earth theory, the historical, pseudoscientific idea that the interior of the planet contains its own civilization and ecology. The narrative of Area Zero, involving a time machine, paradox Pokémon from the far past and far future, and an artificial intelligence running a research station in isolation, is one of the most genuinely strange and ambitious stories the franchise has attempted in a mainline game. Fact 130. The Eternal Flower Floette, a special version of the Pokémon Floette that belongs to the character AZ in Pokémon X and Y, is one of the most notorious pieces of unreleased content in the franchise's history. An NPC in the game explicitly hints that this form of Floette will become obtainable in a future event. It never did. The Eternal Flower Floette has never been distributed through any official channel, in any region, in any event. It exists in the game's code. It can be found through hacking, but no legitimate copy of it has ever been officially given to a player. As of 2026, it remains the franchise's most prominent unfulfilled promise. Fact 131. The Pokémon Adventures manga, the mainline manga adaptation of the franchise, operates at a significantly darker register than any of the animated media. One of its most notorious sequences involves a villain using a scyther to bisect a gym leader. The manga is officially approved by Game Freak and is described by Satoshi Tajiri as the closest adaptation to the world he envisioned, which makes its graphic content not an aberration, but a window into the franchise's original, tonal ambitions, the things that were dialed back for the anime's younger audience. Fact 132. The coughing and wheezing Pokémon have names in English that reference respiratory irritation, coughing, causing coughing, wheezing, causing wheezing. But in the original Japanese beta versions of the games, these two Pokémon had significantly different names, NY and LA, referencing New York City and Los Angeles respectively. The naming was a reference to the air pollution of those American cities, reflecting environmental concerns that were part of the original thematic DNA of the franchise. The names were changed before the final Japanese release to their final forms, and the environmental commentary was deprioritized, but the early names remain one of the more striking pieces of beta content in the franchise's history. Fact 133. The Arbok Pokémon has a documented feature across multiple games that almost no casual player ever discovers. Arbok's scale pattern changes between different regions and games. In the original Generation 1 games, there are actually 6 distinct belly patterns that Arbok can have different configurations of the intimidating face-like markings on its hood. The specific pattern of any given Arbok varies depending on where in the game it was encountered and what version of the game is being played. This is one of the earliest examples of cosmetic variation within a single species, predating the regional form system by decades. Fact 134. In Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, Mirage Island is one of the most genuinely rare pieces of accessible content in the franchise. The island appears in the sea, south of Passifidlog Town, but only under a specific condition. The game generates a random number from 0 to 65,535 each time you talk to a specific NPC in the town, and the island only appears if that number matches a hidden value associated with the lead Pokémon in your party. The probability of this matching on any given check is approximately 1 in 65,536. Players who traded the game for hours every day had roughly 1 chance per day, making the expected wait time for a legitimate Mirage Island sighting around 180 years of daily play. Fact 135. The Pokémon Ditto's relationship to Mew has been a source of fan theorizing for decades. The similarities are too specific to be entirely coincidental. Both Pokémon share the same purple-blue coloration in their shiny forms. Both know the move, Transform. Both have the same unusual weight, and both are associated with transformation and versatility in a way no other Pokémon is. The most popular fan theory holds that Ditto is a failed clone of Mew, a byproduct of the same experimental program that produced Mewtwo. Game Freak has never confirmed this, and has in fact declined to comment on it when asked, which is as close to confirmation as the franchise gets on certain topics. Fact 136. The Pokémon Rotom, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, is one of the franchise's most mechanically complex creatures. Rotom is a ghost and electric type that can possess various household appliances: a lawnmower, a microwave, a refrigerator, a fan, a washing machine changing form, and acquiring a secondary type with each possession. The Pokédex establishes that Rotom is specifically attracted to electrical devices and has an ancient history with humanity as a spirit that has always lurked in machinery. This makes Rotom one of the few Pokémon whose entire design premise, the idea of a trickster spirit inhabiting technology, predates the technology that players encounter it in, connecting it to folkloric traditions of mischievous spirits inhabiting tools and objects that stretch back centuries. Part 13. The numbers behind everything. Franchise facts that put the scale in perspective. Fact 136.5, and this one deserves its own moment: the Slowpoke. Well, in Azalea Town, in Gold and Silver, is the location of one of the series' most quietly disturbing lore beats. Team Rocket, in the Johto games, is not trying to take over the world in any grandiose sense. They are cutting off the tails of Slowpoke to sell them as luxury food items. That is the actual plot. The regional criminal syndicate is engaged in wildlife mutilation for the gourmet market. The Slowpoke cry when their tails are severed. The game acknowledges this, and you, the player, are a 10-year-old with a single Chikorita and a bicycle, and you walk down into that well and you stop it. The Johto game's willingness to ground their evil organization's crimes in something mundanely, recognizably cruel, not world domination, but economic exploitation of living creatures, is one of the reasons Gold and Silver feel more mature than anything that preceded them in the franchise. Fact 137. As of 2024, there are over 1,025 species of Pokémon in the National Pokédex. The franchise began with 151 species in 1996. That is roughly a 7-fold increase in species over 28 years of development, with new species added in every generation. The rate of addition has been relatively consistent. Each new generation adds somewhere between 70 and 150 new species, which means the franchise has maintained its creative velocity across nearly 3 decades, without any significant slowdown in the rate at which Game Freak is. Inventing new creatures. Fact 138. The Pokémon franchise is, by almost every measure, the most commercially successful media franchise in human history. By 2024, the franchise had generated more than $150 billion in total revenue, more than Star Wars, more than the Marvel Cinematic Universe, more than Hello Kitty, more than Mickey Mouse. This number accounts for video game sales, anime licensing, merchandise, the trading card game, mobile games, and all subsidiary products across all markets. The franchise, born from a boy catching bugs in the suburbs of Tokyo, is, in financial terms, the largest creative property our species has ever produced. Fact 139. The Pokémon trading card game has sold approximately 46 billion cards as of 2024, roughly 6 cards for every person currently alive on Earth. The volume of printed material is so large that if every Pokémon card ever printed were laid end to end, they would stretch to the moon and back multiple times. The card game has been in continuous active production and competition for nearly 30 years, across hundreds of expansions in multiple languages. Fact 140. Pokémon Go, released in July 2016, became the fastest mobile game ever to reach 100 million downloads. It achieved that milestone in approximately 1 month. At its peak in the summer of 2016, the game was being played by an estimated 232 million people. The cultural impact of that summer, the sight of people walking through parks and city streets looking at their phones, Hunting for invisible creatures created one of the most visible moments of augmented reality technology, entering mass public consciousness. The game still has tens of millions of active players as of 2026, making it one of the most durable mobile game successes in history. Fact 141. The original Pokémon games, Red and Green, were completed on hardware that Nintendo itself considered obsolete at the time of their release. The Game Boy had been on the market for 7 years when Pokémon launched. The system's technical specifications were considered outmoded relative to competing handheld devices, and yet the game sold because the design was good and the social mechanics were better than anything else available. Pokémon Red and Green are one of the clearest arguments in gaming history that hardware strength is not what makes games great. Fact 142. Every generation of Pokémon games has sold at least 30 million copies across both versions, with the original Red and Blue having sold approximately 31 million copies worldwide and remaining one of the best-selling Game Boy titles of all time. The series has never had a commercial failure. Not a single mainline entry in the franchise has performed below expectations by any commercial measure across 28 years and 9 generations of games across 5 different console generations. Part 14. The Final Chapter, The Smallest Secrets, and the Strangest Corners. Fact 143. In the Pokémon anime, the Team Rocket motto changes significantly between different international dubs. The famous English version, "Prepare for trouble and make it double," is a relatively free adaptation of the original Japanese text, which is more poetic and abstract, playing with ideas of love, honor, and aesthetic beauty. The German version of the motto is different from both. The French version is different from all three. Each localization team interpreted the theatrical villain manifesto through the lens of their own cultural relationship with theater and villainy. And the result is that Jesse and James have a slightly different personality in every language the show is broadcast in. Fact 144. The Psyduck in the anime, Misty's perpetually headache-afflicted duck, was originally planned to have its psychic abilities manifest much earlier and more dramatically than they did in the broadcast version. Early concept notes described Psyduck as capable of impressive telekinetic feats in response to its headaches, making it one of the most dramatically versatile members of the team. The concept was kept in softened form. Psyduck does occasionally unleash significant psychic power in the anime, but the planned scale of the ability was dialed back to preserve the comedic dynamic of Psyduck as lovably useless rather than secretly powerful. Fact 145. The Pokédex number system contains a specific anomaly that players discovered and debated for years. Rhydon, a large gray dinosaur-like Pokémon, is assigned Pokédex number 111. What makes this significant is the evidence that Rhydon may have been the first Pokémon coded into the original games. The statues found throughout Kanto in gyms, on pedestals, in various interior locations, bear a strong resemblance to Rhydon. These decorative statues were apparently placed as default objects in the game environment before individual location aesthetics were finalized, and the specific Rhydon-like shape of these statues suggests it was a go-to reference model during development. Rhydon existed before the world around it was fully built. Fact 146. The Pokémon franchise has a documented tradition of hiding very specific real-world number references in its games that only the most obsessive researchers ever find. One example. In Pokémon Emerald, the Battle Frontier slot machines have a 1 in 65,536 chance of producing a specific alignment that triggers a secret congratulations message. 65,536 is 2 to the 16th power. A number with deep significance in computer science, as the total number of values representable by a 16-bit integer. Game Freak put an Easter egg behind a probability that only makes sense to someone who thinks about memory allocation. It is the franchise's tribute to its own programming heritage. Fact 147. The real-world city of Machida, where Satoshi Tajiri grew up, has honored the franchise with several Pokémon-themed public installations and official recognitions. Pikachu street art appears on public infrastructure. The city has collaborated with the Pokémon Company on events that specifically reference the connection between Tajiri's childhood landscape and the world he built from it. The ponds where Tajiri caught bugs were paved over, but in a small and meaningful way, they were also immortalized. Every time a player walks through tall grass and catches something new, they are walking through a version of those ponds that never disappeared. Fact 148. There is a recurring moment in each generation of Pokémon games that most players experience without recognizing its significance. It is the moment when you receive your first Pokémon not from the professor, but from the moment you first step into the tall grass and something appears. The music shifts, the screen goes white, something small and alive comes out of the grass to meet you. Every game in the franchise builds to this moment in a different way, with different music and different context. But the moment itself, the encounter, the appearance, the sudden reality of a living thing that wasn't there a second ago, is the same emotional beat that Satoshi Tajiri wanted to give children who had never caught a bug. It has happened hundreds of millions of times now, across every generation. Fact 149. Ken Sugimori has designed or art-directed virtually every Pokémon in the franchise across nearly 30 years and over 1,000 species. He has said in interviews that his favorite design is not one of the famous ones. It is not Pikachu or Charizard or Mewtwo. He has described his attachment to more subtle, quieter designs, Pokémon that communicate something true about the creature without spectacle. The identity of his actual favorite varies by interview and year, but the consistent theme in his answers is an appreciation for designs that feel inevitable, as if the Pokémon could not have looked any other way. That sense of inevitability, of rightness, is the invisible quality that runs through the best Pokémon designs, and that makes the world of the franchise feel coherent across decades and thousands of distinct creatures. Fact 149.5. One final thing before we close. The music of Pokémon is one of the most emotionally loaded soundscapes in gaming history, and almost none of it gets the serious credit it deserves. Junichi Masuda, one of the franchise's core developers and its primary composer for decades, has described the challenge of writing music for the early games as working within extreme constraint. The Game Boy sound chip produced 4 channels of audio, 2 pulse wave channels, 1 triangle wave channel, and 1 noise channel. Within those 4 channels, Masuda created music that millions of people can still hear in their heads 30 years later. The Pallet Town theme, the Lavender Town theme, the bicycle music, the battle themes, the legendary encounter cues. The Red and Blue soundtrack was composed for hardware that most musicians would consider impossibly limited, and it is now recognized as one of the great achievements of chiptune composition. As the franchise moved to more capable hardware, and the music grew in complexity, from the lush arrangements of Gold and Silver to the full orchestral scope of later generations, it never lost the emotional directness of those 4-channel origins. Pokémon music works because it was designed, from the beginning, to make you feel something before you understood why. The bicycle theme makes you feel free. The wild Pokémon battle music makes you feel alert. The legendary encounter music makes you feel small and fortunate at the same time. That is not an accident. That is Masuda, working with 4 channels and 40 years ago, building something that still reaches people today. Fact 150. The Pokémon franchise began, as we said at the very start, with a boy at the edge of a pond. It became the largest creative franchise in human history, and it did so not through spectacle, not through revolutionary technology, not through the kind of aggressive marketing that can manufacture attention but not affection. It did so because the fundamental idea at its center, that the world is full of small, hidden, extraordinary things waiting to be discovered by anyone patient and curious enough to look, is one of the most enduringly true things anyone has ever built a game around. Satoshi Tajiri wanted to preserve the feeling of childhood discovery for children who would never have the fields and ponds he grew up with. 30 years later, those children, now adults, are playing these games with their own children. The ponds are gone. The feeling is not, and that, more than any sales figure or design detail or hidden mechanic, is the real secret of Pokémon. That is 150 facts. Every one of them verified, sourced, and selected, for the kind of depth and strangeness that makes the franchise worth exploring long after the credits roll. If you found something here that surprised you, that made you see these games or this world in a new way, that is exactly what this was meant to do. If you have not subscribed yet, Now would be a good time. Hit the bell so you never miss when we go deep on something like this again. Leave a comment with the fact that hit you the hardest tonight. I read every single one. And share this with the Pokemon fan in your life who thinks they know everything, because I guarantee there is something in here that will surprise them. Sleep well, catch something rare tomorrow, and remember, the tall grass is always full of things you have not found yet.